Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Becoming Chiron, the key to unlocking healing and personal alchemy, with your hostess, me, Ursula Duffy. And I am continuing on now with episode 3 of a three-part series that I started called Discovering Your Soul's Calling. And it's all about the story of how I kind of came to be in this moment, in this chair, recording this podcast. It's all about my healing journey that was part of it and my exit from the corporate world. So the episodes 2 and 3 of this podcast are parts 1 and 2 of that story. So we're going to dive into part 3 today. And I'm titling this part 3, My Spiritual Reawakening, and my story of becoming an aromatherapist and an astrologer. And like I said in the last episode, what I'd like to do with every episode is to do a little astro-weather check before we even get into the stories and the details of the episode. I'm recording this on Monday, June 13th, 2022, right around 3:30 in the afternoon. Tomorrow morning here on the East Coast, we have a full moon in Sagittarius. Sun in Gemini, moon in Sagittarius. It's waxing to fullness as we speak. And this full moon may feel a little ungrounded. And I say that because it's going to be almost exactly square the planet Neptune. And when we're talking about Neptune, we're talking about the unseen realms, our subconscious to an extent. And Neptunian energy is beautiful as it relates to our empathy and our emotions and our creativity and imagination, our connection to spirit, but it can feel very confusing. If you think about Pisces energy, Neptune's the modern ruler of the sign of Pisces, and it's the vastness of the ocean. And we're in mutable energy right now. Our seasons are changing. We're moving into summer, and that's the modality that relates to adaptability and to change. So if you're feeling like you're floating on the vastness of the ocean or drowning in the vastness of the ocean, or if there's just any tension, it's important to release the emotions. Remember that emotion is energy in motion. So if you're feeling anything intense bubbling up right now, it's important to release it. But it's also important, what we have, the aspect that we're looking at with this full moon is called a T-square. And whenever we have a T-square, there's the point of tension. Squares are tense aspects that are like a call to action. They call us to do something. It's like a threshold experience. When there's nothing on the other side, that's the T-square. The blow-off point, or like the release valve, is we look to the other side. So we have the square between Neptune, the sun, and the moon. The moon are opposite during a full moon. So that's why we have this T-square aspect. And the sign that we can look to for relief is opposite Pisces, which is where Neptune is, and that's Virgo. So if you're feeling kind of lost in the mist of all of this full moon energy right now, and tomorrow and a couple days on the other side of it, get grounded. If you have a garden, getting in your garden would be like the perfect way to establish some kind of, earth beneath your feet experience to kind of come away from a lot of the headiness and maybe feeling a little bit lost in all of the energy right now. Mercury has just also shifted back into the sign of Gemini. We are still in the post-retrograde shadow right now. So all of our minds and our thoughts and still kind of reviewing what happened during the recent retrograde is all part of this experience as well. And Mars and Chiron are coming together in the sign of Aries for their every 2-year conjunction. And that's happening over the next day or so. So that's also really important because there's a healing energy that comes along with this, but also the state of the world right now is just crazy. So that can tend to happen when Mars and Chiron come together. And like I said, just try and get yourself grounded if possible and emote in a healthy way. That's the best way to work with what we have going on in the cosmos right now. So that is the astro-weather check. Today, I am going to talk about, like I said, my spiritual reawakening. I guess I'll pretty much start at the beginning there. That's where this all sort of started to unfold for me. And I call it a reawakening because I feel that we're all born awake or connected to spirit. That's what I mean by my spiritual reawakening or an awakening. And it just gets turned off by all the things that we go through in our lives as children. And it's a really important and unique experience when we reconnect. And it was a pretty interesting experience for me. It's been very intense. And like I said in, I think, the second episode when I talked about my exit from the corporate world, a lot of deconditioning and a lot of undoing. But I feel more alive than ever now. And having that connection and learning how to reconnect was extremely important to how I got to be sitting in this chair right now. So that was all interesting as well, because the job that I talked about that I left, the career path, brought two very important life events to fruition for me. One, it's how I met my husband. And two, it's the situation that was the catalyst for this reawakening experience. It was in, I think it was 2013. We hired a new staff person. And for me, it was just a nightmare of an experience. This person presented one way during the interviews and everything. And then the person that showed up was like a night and day difference. And it was terrible. It was awful. My everyday was extremely stressful. I was pretty much doing the job of two people because she was extremely incompetent, and needed to be, all her work needed to be double checked and or redone. So it was hard. It made my work days very, very difficult. And it got to the point where it was just so stressful that it was spilling over outside of the workday into my personal life. I was bringing my frustrations and my anger home, and it was just consuming me. So I was telling my sister the story about what was going on and just sort of getting some anger off my chest and talking to her about it. And she said to me, you should listen to this podcast. This might be helpful. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm pretty sure it was something along those lines. And podcast kind of started coming around like 2009, I think. And I had never even heard of or listened to a podcast at that point. So that was a whole new experience in general. And the podcast that she referred me to was, and is, that they're still doing it to this day, called Psychic Teachers. Highly recommend. So I tuned in. I got my app all set up and I found them, and I think the first episode I picked to listen to was called Are You Psychic? And it was really interesting because throughout my entire life, the intuitive side of myself scared me. I've always been able to sense energies around me, not only of other people that I can see, but unseen as well. I had trouble sleeping a lot when I was growing up because I think there were lots and lots of spirits and activity in the house that I grew up in, and it terrified me knowing that there was something there that I could feel that I couldn't see. And we get all of this put into our heads growing up that, it's a ghost and it's bad and it's this horrible thing. So all of that conditioning came into play as well. And I was just so scared. I used to have, and still do, very intense and vivid dreams, even precognitive dreams to an extent. And that always scared me. It's just something that I just never talked about and tried to ignore, tried to turn it off, always tried to turn it off. So I was listening to this episode, Are You Psychic? And that is pretty much what they talked about and how to know. And they talked about the clairs and the chakras. And it was just, I kept getting chills when I was listening. So thankfully, we were all able to work independently And I was able to listen to these podcasts and all these episodes. They started, I believe, in 2010. So they had quite a bit of a library built up at this point. So I listened while I worked. And I started incorporating the practices that they taught. I started buying books and learning about, it pretty much started with meditation, learning about my chakras and kind of fine tuning and figuring out which clair was more prevalent for me, or is more prevalent for me. And working with crystals as well. The first crystals that I purchased were a chakra set per their recommendation. And I just started getting meditation apps and books and crystals and listening and learning and learning and learning and practicing and practicing and practicing. And that all started March of 2015. And because part of my intention with this podcast is to, bring this down to reality and ground it in and talk about the lived experience. I had never done this until I was preparing for this episode, but I looked up the transits to my own chart when in the beginning of March of 2015. And I'd already known part of this. I knew that there were eclipses at play because that was part of my astrology journey, which I'll get into. But I didn't know some of the other things that were happening. And looking at this chart, it's extremely interesting. So I'll share a little bit about that too. I had eclipses happening on my sun during this time. I had the planet Pluto squaring my sun at this point, which definitely relates to transformation and spiritual awakening experiences. And eclipses on natal planets, sometimes it can be a non-event, and other times it can be a whammy of something that happens and puts you on a different course, more in tune with your soul's purpose. That's how eclipses work. I had the planet Jupiter transiting my north node in Leo. At the beginning of March, Jupiter was at 14 degrees and my north node's at 17. Did not know that. So that's pretty cool to see that. And that just brings abundance to why I came here, and a spiritual touch and a gift. That's what Jupiter does. Jupiter expands. So having that being part of this experience, now seeing it, makes total sense to me. Also, I had the planet Uranus opposing my sun, which also screams spiritual awakening to an extent, but also having astrology be part of it. A lot of astrologers call Uranus the father of astrology. So that coming into play and having it be something that was magical, but catalyzing, but also a little bit out of the blue. I never expected this coming out of the situation that I was dealing with. I also had Mars and Venus conjunct in Aries opposing my sun. Aries is my 12th house, which is the space that relates to our connection to spirit and our unconscious coming to the surface and all of those things. And I also had Chiron opposing my moon. I have my moon's in Virgo at 20 degrees. And in early March of 2015, Chiron was at 16 degrees of Pisces. Also something I did not know about until I looked at this chart. So pretty cool to see in retrospect, all the things that were working on my natal chart at the time. And it's interesting too, because I have very specific clusters of planets. I forget the term for it. I know that there is a term for this, but all of my natal planets, except for Chiron, are on one side of my nodes as well. So I always translate that experience to, as things come into squares to the natal planets, also over the natal planets, like I talked about, eclipses were happening on my sun at this time, but also the importance of an opposition. And a lot of my life experience, especially this part of the journey in particular, I'm sure as I go back and look in more deeper detail with all of the transits throughout my life, which I haven't really done yet, but I think that's an important self-study. When things come into opposition, it really does activate in such a unique way. And the experience is, for me in particular, has just been wild. And just looking back on these things, it all makes so much sense. especially Uranus going through my 12th too. That really wakens up hidden parts of ourselves, or parts of ourselves that are just unknown to ourselves at the time. Uranus is the great awakener. So just to touch on the transits, I thought that was important. And then, okay, so developing my spiritual practice. My sun is in the 6th house of my chart, which relates to daily routine. So making meditation and working with my chakras and crystals and all of these things part of my daily routine and ritual was very important to this experience. I felt like I needed to build a very solid foundation just because I wanted to make this a part of my life and be able to connect with my spirit team on my own. And that kind of stuff, it takes time. For me, at least, it did. Many meditations and practice and learning and all of the things helped me build a really solid foundation and then establish a routine connection with my team, my spiritual team. So I'm listening to psychic teachers. I've become a sponge at this point. And then the first part, or the second part, I guess you could say, really comes in for me in the fall of 2015. And that was the aromatherapy part. I started getting into oils during this time, and we will do shows about aromatherapy. I have a lot to say on the topic, but my journey started in a place where I was using oils in an unsafe way, not knowing it at the time, just following along with what one of the companies puts out, which we'll get into that in a different episode. But I learned that I was doing that through, again, something that my sister sent me. It was a free webinar from Aroma Head Institute. At the time, it was Andrea Bouget who was doing the webinars and everything. She's kind of stepped back at this point. She was my teacher. And these two other wonderful women have kind of taken over more of the education and the company at this point in time. But it was a free webinar on lavender, which was just always has been one of my favorite aromas and oils. And the webinar was about the two different types of lavender. And I was just totally wowed because I had no idea. Well, there's many different types, but there are two main types and they have very different properties. So I watched this webinar, I signed up and everything. I was very curious and she did a fantastic job. Andrea's a wonderful, wonderful teacher. And I learned all about so many things that I didn't know about, including safe and effective use. And it got me really enthralled and interested and wondering, what is this whole thing and why was I drawn to it in the first place? And the whole thing with the lavender, come to find out, many years later that it's the signature oil for the sign of Virgo, and that's my moon. I have 2 other planets in Virgo, so it makes sense that I'd be naturally drawn to lavender. And part of the webinar was an offer to enroll in her aromatherapy certification program. So I thought it over and I mulled about it and I was like, how am I going to do this working full time? This is so expensive. I'm not sure. And at this point, I was using meditation as a practice to get answers. I think I had my pendulum at this point. So part of my decision-making process was touching in with spirit. And the answer was yes. So I enrolled, and it was a completely online self-study at your own pace program, which was perfect for me. So I started doing it in my free time in the evenings and on weekends. And so the ball was rolling on that, and I was learning so much and building my oil collection at this point, as that was part of the class material. And I had to do case studies and all of that. So learning how to work with them, purchasing them, and building my collection was all part of the experience. And that was fall of 2015. And for a long time, many, many months, I was doing all of this alone. And I was craving community. And it just so happened that in early 2016, on Psychic Teachers, one of the psychic teachers, Samantha, announced that she was starting a new program, offering a new class called Be Your Own Psychic. And this was going to be her first time teaching it. It was all online, which was great. And I signed up. And that was all of March of 2016. I was in psychic school. And it was with a group of wonderful women. And it was very much hands-on learning with her, but also exercises and reading material and partner exercises. So every week we were partnered with somebody and we had to do her instruction and practice and stay in touch and, you know, work our muscles, practice what we were learning. And that was really cool. And part of it was crystals. So I learned more about crystals. Part of it was energetic protection. And it was an incredible 1 month intense intuitive development class. Another part of it was mediumship, which ended up being the one thing that I was still super, super scared of. And it ended up being the one exercise that I put off till the very last minute. But then when I did it, it was an incredible experience. Just like I said in the beginning, I feel like we're all born awake. I also feel like we all have these intuitive gifts, and to an extent, if we learn how to do it and practice it, we can all be mediums as well. So I learned that about myself during this intuitive development class, magical month of March in 2016, which I had no idea. And it was just more synchronicity and just more chills and total excitement. This whole experience was just so magical. And it ended up being one of my favorite things, was doing mediumship work. So the class ended in the end of March, and I had this online community now. I had a spiritual tribe. I had all these wonderful people that I learned with, that I was partnering with. I'm in touch with a few of them still to this day, which is wonderful. And we decided, in order to continue on with our practices, there was a group of us that continued on working together, practicing together, working our muscles more and more. And we went on and we created this group called Soul Sisters. And this was how I practiced. And I did, in cooperation with other women from the class in this group that we created, we did free readings I pretty much did free readings for an entire year. And I did a mixture of intuitive work, mediumship work, and just practice with my classmates that became my friends, and we continued on. And after, I want to say a year or two, that group kind of fizzled out a bit. We all kind of parted ways and went in our own directions. But I still stayed friends with a couple of the people. And through that friendship, those friendships, and also, interestingly, through psychic teachers, still, I was guided to the next thing, which was astrology. So I'm still, doing all the practices, meditating, continuing on with my intuitive development and studying aromatherapy online. This was now 2017, and it was the summer of 2017. And it was like a faucet opened, or almost like a fire extinguisher, or a hydrant, I think, that I was getting incredibly synchronistic and repeating, and I just knew something was up. Kept getting symbolism like dragons and scenes from The Wizard of Oz, The Yellow Brick Road, the Dark Side of the Moon album cover with the prism on it. These were some of the things that kept coming up in like my social media feeds, or words that I would hear from people walking by me or on TV. And it was just coming at me from all sources. And I was like, what is going on here? And this was going on now for many months. And dragons were never anything that I had thought about or tapped into. I didn't even know that there was the whole elemental realm to an extent, and dragons were part of it. So I'm just at this point, part of my practice was documentation. So I'm just journaling and noting and making some kind of, trying to make some kind of sense of all this. And because it was so popular, I knew that there was an eclipse that was coming, because it was called the Great American Eclipse, and it was going to be a total one that we could see, and that was going to go all the way across our country. And I just became obsessed with this eclipse. Even looked at traveling to Nashville and South Carolina to try and go see it, but that just didn't really work out. So I ended up taking the day off. I think it happened on a Monday, and went to the beach to watch it. And after this eclipse happened, I was still getting all of this symbolism, but I had very specific physical effects from it. I was exhausted. My digestive system was off. I just felt sick for like a week. And I'm like, what is going on with me? What is happening? And of course, I'm sharing all of this with the spiritual tribe that I had at this point. And it ended up being, I got into a couple other podcasts at this point in time. And one of them was called, I'm not sure if he still does it, but Brandon Beecham had a podcast called Positive Head. And that was one of the ones that I was listening to pretty often also. And Samantha, one of the psychic teachers, Deb, one of the psychic teachers, ended up doing individual interviews on Positive Head. And I think that's how I got into listening to Positive Head. And then I think it was maybe a month after the eclipse. Yeah, it was about a month after the eclipse. One of my friends listened to a fairly recent episode of Positive Head, and it had on this astrologer named Adam Summer. And one of the other things that I almost forgot to mention, I kept waking up with the song, the Dave Matthews song, The Space Between, in my head during this time as well. That's a really important part of the story that I almost forgot. So my friend texts me and she's like, you got to listen to this episode, because she's been listening to what I've been going through the whole time with the dragons and the song and all the things. So I listened, and it's an interview with Adam, and he's talking about the eclipse. And he says in this episode that he calls the space between eclipses a dragon hole. And I was blown away, because that put together every single piece of information and guidance and synchronicity and symbols and all the things that I was getting around the eclipse and after the eclipse together in one freaking sentence. So I started doing some research on him. I started looking into astrology. One of my friends during psychic school tried to get me into astrology initially, and I was just like, no, what is this? I don't get this. What are houses? Like, no, I can't. This makes no sense to me, and I don't have time for it. So that's an interesting part too. So Adam apparently had his own podcast. So I started listening to that religiously, going, he was doing it since 2009 as well, like a year before Psychic Teachers started. And I just listened to as many of his episodes as I could. And I was just like on this astrology journey now at this point. Like there was no turning back. I ended up booking a reading with him. He had what he called the eclipse journey, which I thought was appropriate considering these experiences I was having around this particular eclipse. Turns out that it was at like, I think 26 or 28 degrees of Leo, which is in proximity to my North Node. So this was a really important eclipse for me, which is why I was getting all these downloads and this intensity of the experience. That was very, like, I want to say 3 or 4 months before my nodal return. So it was a big deal. So I booked the reading with Adam. We had our first one on November 10th of 2017. First time I ever even looked at my own chart was a couple months prior. I did a beginner class with a friend, and I was in. I couldn't believe it. It was just like something dropped out of the sky and fell into my lap. But lo and behold, it was, of course, in perfect divine timing. So Adam tells me, I think during the second or third reading, or this was a 4-reading package that ended, I think we did our last one right before the winter solstice. So he told me that he was opening his doors for his next apprenticeship program. And once again, this was, how am I going to do this? Where am I going to find the time between working and my aromatherapy studies and the intuitive practice and all the things? So of course I again turned to spirit, and of course spirit delivered and over delivered. And I enrolled in Adam's apprenticeship program, which began in January of 2018. So at this point, I was very far into my aromatherapy studies. I was pretty much at the point of a couple remaining classes, taking my final, and the last thing I had to do was write a research paper. So I did not know what to write about. I was totally stumped, had no idea what, I didn't want to really pick an oil. It's just nothing seemed right. The apprenticeship program starts. It's a very intense 1-year program, class every Wednesday, labs for 2 hours on the weekend and during the week as well. One was required, so I did the weekend one primarily. I fit it in, I did it, I made it happen. And I gave my first reading at a retreat with my classmates in May of 2018, and we were doing practice with each other during the time. That was part of the class as well, but doing my first reading for a stranger was intense and I loved it. And our final for that program was to do a reading for a stranger with no preparation. I had to pull up the person's chart as soon as we got on the Zoom call and then do the reading and have it reviewed by him in order to quote unquote graduate. So that was intense as well. The whole thing was intense, but it felt so right. The whole time it just felt so right. Everything about it. There was so much synchronicity. And my friend sent me a book during my apprenticeship program in 2018 called Astrological Aromatherapy. And I voraciously read it and was so excited because I knew that was the thing. And that's where I got that information that this woman's work, Patricia Davis, she's incredible. That's what I base a lot of my work on as far as when I do astrological aromatherapy. That's how I found out that she figured out that Virgo was a good fit, or lavender was a good fit for the sign of Virgo. And when I had the 2 pieces of the information, the puzzle felt complete. I wrote my paper and I pretty much got my aromatherapy certification and my professional astrologer certification in the same week. It was incredible. So I started putting the pieces together. I shared my whole journey that was also happening during the year of 2018 with the surgery and all those things that I talked about. And then in the episode before that, talked about, all this kind of happening concurrently, all the stories kind of coming together and the twists and the turns and everything, kind of like a multi-layered experience. And I got to work. I started putting myself out there on social media. I think I created my Instagram account first, Instagram and Facebook. I'm no longer on Facebook, but I still have my Instagram. And I just started writing and putting myself out there, doing reading events, and opened up started Ursa Alchemy in early 2019, got my website up and running, and here I am. And that's part 3 of the story. And it's been an incredible ride. I must say, it is something that I never thought about, never thought would happen, was completely shocked and awed along the way. And I can't believe that it all kind of worked out the way that it did, but it did. And now I know in retrospect, looking back, that the intuitive development part had to come first. Because otherwise, I don't know if I would have been as in tune with the messages and the guidance and all of the things that came along with the whole journey. So if you're at the very beginning of your spiritual reawakening, I highly recommend making it a habit. If you don't end up doing anything with it besides having that soul space for yourself and that connection to spirit, I think that it's an extremely important part of our lifetimes here and why we come to Earth School. And the self-awareness that astrology can provide is invaluable. The self-awareness that all of the things that come along with the whole journey. There were so many pieces for me in my story that I didn't really touch on, but Reiki certifications came along with it. The mediumship part, like I talked about, and just doing things like past life regressions and Akashic records readings. It's all sort of a different route for tapping into the same thing, but it's important to pay attention to whatever you're guided to, whatever the reason is, even if it's just to wake up. And I highly recommend psychic teachers. I highly recommend just having a meditation practice and knowing that that doesn't have to look any specific way. There's so many different ways to do it. But just having some kind of connection to spirit is so important. So important. So that is, in a nutshell. There's other parts that I'll probably touch on and talk about during other episodes, but this is the conclusion of the 3-part series that I call Discovering Your Soul's Calling. And that was my journey of discovering my soul's calling. And I hope that any part of the stories that I told helps you. And just know that it's all in perfect divine timing. That's probably one of the biggest takeaways, especially looking back on the astrology that I shared. So important to know that. So thank you all for tuning in and for listening to another episode of Becoming Chiron. I want to remind everybody that I do offer astrology readings and astrological aromatherapy services. When I do astrological aromatherapy, I create a blend based on your chart using the signature oil guidance from Astrological Aromatherapy by Patricia Davis. And that's been a pretty magical experience as well. So those services are out there. I also love doing solar return readings. So if you're a Gemini and it's your birthday season, birthday month, I would love to do a solar return reading for you. And all of my services are available on seagoddesshealingarts.com on the Ursa Alchemy page. And thanks for tuning in to another episode. And I will put the call out to Spirit to figure out what to talk about next time, as I have some topics swirling, but you know, that's how I roll with these topics and these shows. So we'll figure out what will be coming in a couple of weeks. And I hope that everybody has a healthy full moon experience. Like I said, get in your garden if you can, or get grounded if you're feeling like your head's in the clouds or confused. And till next time, remember to be a maverick.